The Golden Amazons of Venus by John Murray Reynolds. From Planet Stories, Winter 1939. As found on Project Gutenberg. Read by Julie Hoverson. The Golden Amazons of Venus, Part 5. The suspicion that had come to Jerry Norton seemed impossible. Walter Lansing? The Lord Lanza. It couldn't be! And yet, he was sure he had seen that same mutilated hand thrust out from the sleeve of a green robe an hour before. Lansing was still talking as he bent over the improvised map. "Here's the line of the Geary River. Tell them to cross by the Bald Gray Hill, then bear west 6 north, using Venusian magnetic bearings. After that—" He suddenly stopped and looked up, catching Jerry's grim glance fixed on his left hand. Hastily, he jerked it aside into the shadows. He must have read in Jerry's eyes that his move had been too late, for his own gaunt face hardened. "You rat!" Jerry hissed between his teeth. His right hand shot out, clutching for the other man's throat, but Lansing twisted aside and jerked a dark object from his pocket. An instant later, a stinging cloud of the paralysis gas took Jerry in the face, and he fell limply to the floor. Lansing straightened up and tossed aside the flask that had held the gas. There was a savage gleam in his narrow eyes. "All right, Norton," he said. "We'll do it the other way." "Ho! Guards!" A gong sounded in the corridor. The pulsating green light immediately flooded the cell. Scaly-skinned guards swarmed in and saluted. Lansing ripped off the torn uniform, revealing a tight-fitting green garment beneath it, and one of the guards helped him on with the cowled robe he had worn before. He glanced down at Jerry for a moment. "Bring him and the others up to me when he recovers the use of his muscles," he said. By the time Jerry Norton recovered from the effects of the gas, he had been securely bound again. 2 guards led him to the end of a corridor and up a flight of stairs to the level above. This was also part of the prison zone of the castle, but built in an entirely different manner. Walls and floor were of a polished green metal. Supercharged electronic locks fastened each door, holding death for anyone who attempted to tamper with them. Metal globes gave a steady light. Mirrors above each cell door gave the guards who lounged in the corridors a complete view of the inside of every cell. This, Jerry realized, was actually the prison used by the lords of Giri-Vaka. He had been placed in the old and abandoned dungeons beneath as part of the scheme to lure him into calling the Viking to her doom. Glancing in the door mirrors of the cells as he went by, Jerry saw that most of the occupants were men and women of the green race of Giri, with a fair number of golden Amazons, and a few reptile men who had been guilty of some crime or infraction of discipline. Then he saw Clozana. The girl was tightly spread-eagled against one of the polished metal walls of her cell, her outstretched wrists and ankles held by steel cuffs. Jerry's jaw jutted stubbornly forward, and for a moment he twisted helplessly against the cords that held his arms behind him. The guards halted before a door deep in the interior of the palace, where a pair of scaly warriors stood on guard with gas guns cocked and ready. The opening itself was not closed by any door, but by what looked like a tightly stretched curtain of some transparent green material. On closer inspection, he saw that it glowed with a steady pulsation, while occasional specks of green fire ran through it. When one of the guards moved incautiously back so that the tip of his scabbard touched the green glow filling the door, there was a crackling hiss. The tip of the scabbard simply vanished. It was as though it had been cleanly cut off by a very sharp knife. A challenge came from within, and one of Jerry's guards shouted a reply. The green glow suddenly vanished from the doorway. Whatever elemental force it was that blocked the passage had been withdrawn, and they walked freely in through the opening. The wide room before them was walled with slabs of polished black marble. The figures of writhing snakes and rearing reptiles were inlaid into the black walls with some iridescent green stone. Their eyes were inlaid jewels. Thin trails of pungent smoke drifted upward from their nostrils. A low and throbbing music, full of the thunder of muted drums, came from an unseen source. At regular intervals around the walls stood tall golden standards with glowing globes atop them. This was the throne room of Lanza, Lord of Girivaka, who had once been an officer in the flying forces of Earth. The man himself sat on a black marble throne with a dozen of the higher officers of his scaly warriors grouped around him. These inner guards wore breastplates and helmets of a bright green metal, and their pointed ears protruded upward through twin openings in the sides of the helmets. Lance's swarthy face was gloatingly triumphant. It had always been Jerry Norton's private opinion that Walter Lansing was slightly mad, brilliant in many ways, but definitely unstable. At last he appeared to have slipped over that shadowy border that divides the rational from the insane.
"It is unfortunate that my little scheme to have you summon your spaceship here did not work," Lanza said in English, "but we will find some other way of persuading you to do it."
"You think you're quite the little tin god, don't you?" Jerry sneered.
"I am a god to these people," Lanza replied quietly. "Though the Stardust was damaged too badly to return to Earth, little of her equipment was harmed except for the rocket tubes themselves. Within 6 months after landing, I had made myself master of these primitive but obedient people. The submarine that brought you from the city of Lar shows what can be done with them. In the meantime, I had communicated with friends on Earth by means of a secret radio frequency and waited for the sending of the next spaceship."
He broke off as a door behind the throne opened and a woman came into the room. It was Olga Stark, now wearing a long gown of shimmering green. Metal strands of the same color were braided into her dark hair, which was crowned by a circlet bearing the design of a rearing serpent. All the officers and courtiers lifted their arms in salute. The woman walked over and stood beside Lance's throne, looking down at Jerry with a cold and impersonal scorn. It had not taken Olga Stark very long to fit herself into the role of the Queen of Girivaka. A number of things were clear to Jerry Norton now. It had been Olga Stark with whom Lansing had secretly communicated after he made himself master of the Scaly Ones, and that explained her insistent request to join the expedition. Again, it had been Olga who had been surreptitiously using the radio to talk to Lansing that day when Jerry had stepped into the radio room on hearing the hum of the generator. They had been arranging the details of his abduction. Only, who was Olga's confederate who had knocked him over the head when he had walked in on them that time? There was still some traitor on board the Viking.
"I have now developed the resources of this country to the point where the final campaign is ready," Lanza boasted. "All these reptile men needed was a man of sufficient brains and initiative to lead them. We are making ray tubes modeled on those aboard the Stardust, and will soon be able to blast down the guardian forts of Savisa and to conquer those few other portions of this planet that still stand against me. Then I will return to Earth in your Viking, taking with me enough gold to buy a vast fleet of ships. There is more gold available here on Venus than all your banks on Earth have ever imagined. I could make myself ruler of Earth with all that gold, but I will choose another method. I will bring back the spaceships and load them up with my scaly warriors, and then sail to conquer the outer planets and whatever else may lie beyond the solar system."
Jerry Norton stared at Lanza in a grim silence. The man was undoubtedly mad. Stark, raving mad. No one but a maniac would cherish such a wild dream of universal conquest. He had that dangerous combination of natural cleverness and distorted values that has often distinguished leaders who have taken nations into the shadowy valleys of ruin. For a moment, Lanza hesitated, his narrow eyes blazing, and one flung up in a dramatic gesture. Then some of the fire went out of him, and he returned to more prosaic and immediate things.
"But all that lies in the future. At the moment, I must ask you to radiophone the Viking to come to the city and land in the plain just below the walls."
I'll see you in hell first," Jerry snapped. Lanza shrugged.
I expected you to indulge in some such heroics. Your type always does. I have not forgotten your attacks on my reputation back on Earth some years ago, Norton, nor your charges that I was unfit to command the Stardust. It will give me considerable pleasure to watch what is about to happen to you. Ho, guards! Bring him down to the torture chamber.
The place of torture was a circular and low-vaulted chamber. Jerry was led across to one of the walls, and his bound hands fastened behind him to a metal ring. The place was lit by a dim green light that had no visible source, though in one spot there was a ruddy glow where irons were heating in a brazier of burning charcoal. A bench was placed for Lanza and Olga to sit on, and 4 of their guards stood beside them. The torturers themselves had been selected from among the green men of Giri, instead of the scaly-skinned warrior race of Vaka. They were squat and heavy men, those torturers, evidently of the most brutal and debased type that Lanza had been able to find. One in particular, whose wide green face was made hideous by an old scar that had put out one of his eyes, licked his thick lips in ghoulish anticipation as his fingers prodded the flesh about Jerry's ribs and felt the Earthman's muscles.
"Bring in the other 2,
Lanza commanded. All about the room were the tools of the torturer's art. Some were familiar things that have been used since men first began to mistreat his fellow creatures, leaded whips and stretching racks and cradles lined with pointed spikes. Others were strange-looking and probably even more horrible mechanisms of coils and wires and electrodes. Jerry licked his lips. The place had the hushed stillness of a chamber that has been thoroughly soundproofed. Probably no screams of agonized victims ever penetrated beyond those smooth walls of polished green metal. They brought Angus McTavish in first. He looked like some shaggy red giant, wearing only a loincloth with his hair and beard all awry. Then came Clozana. Her crossed wrists were tied together before her by a cord that was held by one of the guards, and she was very pale. Lanza nodded quickly.
"Let them begin," said Lanza tonelessly.
"A suggestion, sir." Olga leaned forward on the bench. The glance of her brooding eyes was fixed on the young Amazon princess. "Let them work on the girl first. It will probably succeed more quickly. I think the man Norton has fallen in love with that empty-headed young savage, and you know how men are."
"You are right. Let it be done that way."
Clozana was spread-eagled in midair, her upstretched arms fastened to ropes that led to the ceiling, and her ankles lashed to metal rings in the floor below. She could move nothing but her head as Olga Stark walked up to stand before her. "This will repay for the condescension with which I was treated in Servisa," the Earth woman said venomously. Clozana looked at her in silence for a moment, and then suddenly spat squarely in the other woman's face.
"Atta girl!"
roared Angus with all the power of his big lungs. Olga struck the helpless girl twice in the mouth with her clenched fist, then returned to her seat. "Begin!" she commanded. One of the torturers tossed Clozana's long hair forward on either side of her neck to leave her back entirely bare for the lash. The girl's eyes were closed again, and there was a thin trickle of blood at one corner of her mouth. The torturer shook out the lash, whirled it once through the air, and then brought it smashing across the middle of Clozana's back. The girl's whole body writhed convulsively for a moment. There was an instant red welt where the whip had struck. A low moan escaped between her clenched teeth. Then Jerry Norton leaned forward where he stood, bound against the wall. "You win, Lansing," he said hoarsely. "Stop it. Make them leave her alone, and I'll do as you say."
"I thought you would,"
the renegade officer said softly. There seemed to be a definite disappointment in his cruel eyes.
"I will have the radio set brought here, and you can call the ship right now."
"Have them lower the girl down."
"She stays where she is until you have finished."
The portable radio phone from the wrecked Stardust was brought in and set up on a stand immediately in front of Jerry. Olga set up the sigmoid antenna on its Duralite frame and twisted the dials to the spaceship's wavelength. Then she took the transmitter. Calling Steve Brent on the Viking. Calling Steve Brent on the Viking. Please come in, she repeated over and over. At last the answering signal lit up, and Steve's familiar voice came from the receiver. This is Steve Brent. Who is calling? Olga held the transmitter before Jerry's mouth. Lanza nodded to one of the torturers, who drew a white-hot iron from one of the braziers and held it a little way from Klozana's face. One false word and that iron goes into the girl's eyes, the Lord of Girivaka warned in a low hiss. After that, all of you will live in agony for weeks before we have finished. Tell him to land near the city and bring all but a single watchman to the east gate, where they will be well received. Hello, Steve. This is Jerry Norton, Jerry said. Brent's voice shook with excitement. Jumpin' ray blast, Chief. We all thought you were done for. Where did you go? What happened? Where are you now? I'm being well entertained in the city of Vaka Havsen. These scaly men are very pleasant and friendly when you get to know them. Cross the Giri River by a bald hill. Jerry finished the directions for the coming of the Viking and the landing of its crew as ordered by Lanza. As the radio was turned off, the Lord of the Scaly Ones stood up with his thin-lipped smile. Good. Our plans progress. Now you three will go back to a cell, and since you are no longer of any value to us, you will be used when we hunt the giant Dacta on the shore tomorrow. The three prisoners were placed in the same cell, all spread-eagled against the wall with their outstretched arms held by metal cuffs. Angus McTavish's face was sour and glowering as he turned to Jerry. That was an ill thing that you did, Jerry Norton, he growled. I could not see them whip her any more. The three of us will probably meet as bad a fate soon anyway, from what that thin-faced devil said at the end. And meanwhile, you've lured our comrades to destruction. It couldn't be helped, Jerry said, and closed his eyes. He had taken what was probably the longest chance of his career, and he was not in a mood to talk about it, particularly when every faintest syllable uttered in one of these metal cells could be heard by the guards in the corridor outside. There was little rest for any of them, chained in that awkward position, and with the cell always filled with that pitiless green light. Jerry dozed fitfully from time to time. Klozana seemed to have fallen asleep, drooping forward in her bonds with her head hanging low, but her long hair covered her face and it was hard to tell. Angus made no attempt to sleep at all, and for most of the intervening time he was muttering many-tongued curses into his beard. At last they were freed from their chains. They were given water in metal cups and a bowl of some kind of stew to eat. For perhaps an hour they rested and eased their stiffened muscles. Then more guards came and bound their hands behind them and took them away. It was again broad daylight when they were taken out into the streets of the city, the peculiarly yellow daylight that filtered through the cloudy canopy overhead. The three prisoners were surrounded by a heavy guard of reptile men, who marched them across the city and out through a gate in the far wall. Here a broad plain swept down to the waters of a saffron-colored lake, a sheet of water so vast that its far shore was no more than a dun line across the horizon. A sort of grandstand had been erected along one side of the plain. I think I begin to understand the point of this little game, McTavish muttered, squinting as he peered ahead, and I don't fancy the idea at all. I don't get what you mean, McTavish snorted. Did you never see a piece of cheese in a mousetrap? Then Jerry himself began to understand. On a broad platform before the grandstand stood a line of men armed with gas guns. Some were gray-scaled officers of the fighting forces, and others were dandified green men of the decadent minority that had fawned upon and mingled with their conquerors. In the flat and marshy expanse of the plain before them, there had been driven a number of short but heavy stakes, like tent pegs, each with a metal ring set in the top. There were long rows of them. Gray-scaled guards were busy fettering prisoners to the pegs, making them fast by tying to the metal ring the other end of the long cord with which their hands were tied behind them. The hunters and the audience were ready. The bait was being prepared. Klozana was a few feet away from Jerry, fastened to the next stake. She stood erect, her shoulders drawn back by the strain of her bonds and her long hair blowing in the wind. "This is the end, Jerry," she said. "If not today, then tomorrow or the next day.
This was the tale told in lore of what happens to the prisoners of the Scaly Ones. But I never believed it till now.
That was Part 5 of The Golden Amazons of Venus by John Murray Reynolds. From Planet Stories, Winter 1939, as found on Project Gutenberg, narrated by Julie Hoverson. Music is from Zephon, as found on Jamindo.